Hi, and welcome to Enchantment of Eternity's Game of Thrones video on the analysis of Sansa's character journey. This video is a Patreon suggested video by patron Allison Fordyce. In this video, I will recount and analyze Sansa's character journey from Season 1 up to the present. So first I'll have to start with a spoiler warning for Game of Thrones up to the end of Season 7. If you haven't seen all of Season 7, you may not want to watch this video, otherwise some things may be spoiled for you. Now, in one of the first Game of Thrones videos I've ever done, and still my most popular, where I was predicting how Game of Thrones would end, I predicted that the show would end with Sansa sitting on the Iron Throne. And one of the main reasons I predicted this was because Sansa seemed to be the one character who's changed the most, who we've learned the most about, and who has had the most long-term character arc. So it seems to me if that journey finished with her ruling, that would be a satisfying conclusion. Now, I'm still not sure I feel that way. I think that may or may not be what happens, but the point is she will have been one of the most memorable, measured, and dynamic character journeys of any character in the show, well, in my opinion anyway. So let's jump into it, starting with Season 1. When we first meet Sansa, she's a naive young girl who wants nothing more than to leave Winterfell and move to King's Landing to marry a handsome prince and become a queen. One of the first scenes we see is her begging her mother to let her move to King's Landing to marry Joffrey. And we see her sort of flirting with Joffrey from afar at this big dinner, so it's obvious that during this time she still has an idealistic fantasy tale version of what life could be like. She's too young to differentiate between fantasy and real life, so she's convinced that her life will be the idealistic fairy tale princess who marries a handsome prince. And it's interesting that she tries so desperately to hold on to this fantasy even when real life intercedes to show her things are actually darker than she thinks they are, such as the scary nature of the company that Joffrey keeps with the Hound and Ilyn Payne. But of course, the first big challenge to this perception is when Joffrey was mistreating Arya, which led between a fight between the two of them, which led to her own direwolf being killed, along with Arya's friend. Even in the face of such harshness, Sansa still stubbornly held on to this fantasy, even going as far as to refuse to speak out against Joffrey when questioned about what happened. And this created a rift between Sansa and Arya, and while the audience tended to take Arya's side, and rightfully so, as Joffrey was in fact a creep, even Ned could see it from her perspective that she has to marry Joffrey and thus didn't want to upset this. However, after the incident with losing her direwolf, it did sour her a bit to Joffrey. However, I believe she was still in love with the idea of becoming a queen. And this was smoothed over when Joffrey, who was pushed by her mother, made a romantic gesture to Sansa, which is all she needed to convince herself that her fairy tale life could still work, which is something she still wanted very much to believe. Sansa, though, was extremely ignorant of the political deceit game being played between her father and Joffrey's mother, who at the time were basically fighting over the throne. Cersei wanted it for Joffrey so the Lannisters could seize control of the throne in the Seven Kingdoms, and Ned, who wanted to stay true to the letter of the law and give control to who is rightfully next in line, which he learned is not Joffrey but Stannis. Of course, Sansa knew none of this and was still devoted to her fairy tale life of being a queen. So when her father told her she had to move back to Winterfell, she was very upset and not on board with this at all. Now, one thing I need to point out, because I've seen a lot of people get what happens in the show and what happens in the books mixed up in this regard, and this video is specifically about the show. So in the books, Sansa then goes to Cersei and tells her that her father's preparing to leave, and that helps Cersei intercept them and stop them. But this did not happen in the show. So in the character journey of Sansa in the show, she doesn't have this against her. Instead, she still thinks everything is great when all of a sudden Lannister soldiers come in, kidnap her, and kill all of her family guards and friends. And so she becomes a hostage where these people whom she looked up to in the past and wanted to be like and become their family were suddenly questioning her loyalty and telling her to turn on her father in order to save him. So not only did she go along with this, she made extra efforts to try and ensure her father's life was spared, as on her own she went to Joffrey in public in the throne room and begged for her father's life. So, in her mind, I'm sure she still had no idea why this was happening and saw it as a big misunderstanding, and she still saw Joffrey as this handsome prince, now king, that she wanted to be with. It wasn't until the actual execution, where Joffrey had promised her that her father's life would be spared, but directly went against that and killed him anyway, which was a hugely traumatic incident in her life, to say the least, where she learned this wasn't in fact the case. But more than that is when she finally realized that her fantasy of a handsome prince and becoming a beautiful queen was just that, a fantasy. And after this event, Joffrey started being openly cruel to her, having his guards beat her and actively taunting her, such as forcing her to stare at her father's decapitated head. And at this point, while they were on the bridge, she did move on Joffrey with the intention of killing him, and even though she knew very well that she would die herself in this act. So this, I think, was less of a revenge bloodlust like it would have been with Arya, and more of a way to end her suffering. In fact, I think suicide rather than killing Joffrey was the main point of this attempt. Killing Joffrey would just be an added bonus that he would get what he deserved. But it was the Hound who stopped her, and possibly that his motivation wasn't simply to stop her from killing Joffrey, which was his job, but more of to save her. And this is emphasized by the fact that he didn't let anyone else know what she had just tried to do, because if he did, there would have been dire consequences for her. But I don't want to get too much into that, because that goes more into the Hound's motivations, and this video is more about Sansa. So that brings us to Season 2. Now, Season 2, for the most part, is about Sansa dealing with her status as a hostage. And although the same could be said for Season 3, I'd say Season 2 was overall the low point in her character story, even more so than Season 5, but I'll get to that later. So Season 2 starts with her sitting with Joffrey on his name day celebration, so she's still being presented as the soon-to-be queen, but we see how little regard Joffrey has for her and her opinion. But interestingly enough, we see that Sansa is learning to play her role and is already learning how to manipulate, as she manages to manipulate Joffrey into sparing the life of Sir Dantos. Then she meets Tyrion for the first time, whom she assumes is just like all the other Lannisters because he is a Lannister, but he is in fact the first one to show her sympathy. But I think at this stage she doesn't buy his sympathy and assumes it's a trick. Later, we see her having dinner with Cersei and her family and is acting like a beat hostage, while Tommen and Myrcella are completely oblivious to her suffering. So she plays along with them, as she does with so many others, simply telling people what they want to hear. And interestingly enough, Cersei begins to tutor her to become queen, and I honestly believe at this stage Cersei's intentions are pure, and she is in fact preparing her to be queen. And I do believe that in her own strange way, she actually has some sympathy for her, as she was also forced to marry a man she didn't want to, and you do see these sympathies come out in a few of their scenes together. However, I think these intricacies may be lost on Sansa. I think Sansa starts to realize Tyrion's sympathies are genuine when he saves her from a harsh beating Joffrey is having his men give her, although I still think she doesn't care or otherwise simply doesn't trust Tyrion and thus refuses to show her true feelings to him. So Sansa gets a handmaiden, and Shae, whom at first she uses as a punching bag to take out all of her frustrations on because she has no one else to. Eventually, though, Shae gains her trust, so she learns she can be trusted. In fact, Shae even tries to hide the fact that she got her period from Cersei because she knows this means they would soon force her to bear Joffrey's children, which is the last thing she wants. Another huge moment for her is when she's trapped in the Flea Bottom riots, where she is nearly raped and killed, which is another traumatic moment in her life. But the Hound saves her at the last moment, and I think this is when she's beginning to notice the Hound has a soft spot for her. But when she thanks him, he's cold with her, and I think her response tells that she knows it's an act. So then the Battle of Blackwater happens, where she wishes Joffrey well and he forces her to kiss his sword. But what's interesting is we get another example of her trying to manipulate him, this time trying to manipulate his death, as she talks about how of course he'll be at the front lines. So she's trying to shame him into going where he's most likely going to get killed. Unfortunately, though, her plot doesn't work because his cowardice overpowers his pride. But while she's hiding with the women and children, this is when Cersei intones some of her best advice to Sansa in her own twisted way, talking about tears and what's between her legs being weapons that she can use against men. And when Cersei freaks out and leaves, it is Sansa that manages to calm everyone. And then when Sansa hides in her room and encounters the Hound, she can see through his posturing and threats and is smart enough to know that he has a soft spot for her. So after the battle, it is publicly announced that Joffrey will set aside his marriage to Sansa in favor of marrying Margaery Tyrell. Many others look to Sansa like she's just been devastated and give their condolences, and she's really good at putting on a false face of disappointment for them, but as soon as she's alone, she allows herself to express the joy that she's feeling. But then comes in Peter Baelish, a Littlefinger, to rain on her parade by telling her that her troubles aren't over, that Joffrey will still use her as his plaything, and that he offers to take her away to Winterfell. We later learn this is part of his master plan to seize power, but at the moment, Sansa refuses him, probably rightfully so, because she doesn't trust him. So then we come to Season 3, which continues the hostage under duress theme of Season 2, but with some twist. First off, between seasons, Sansa has seemed to change her mind and is now warming up to Peter Baelish's plan to spirit her away. I don't think it's because she trusts him more, but more if she's learned that he was right, that Joffrey and the Lannisters aren't being any less cruel to her just because he set aside her marriage to her. When they get her warming up, we then get her warming up to the Tyrells. Margaery is also a master manipulator, and at the moment it's in her interest to cozy up to her so she can learn what Sansa knows about Joffrey, and later for political maneuvering on her family's behalf. However, Sansa's completely oblivious to this and sees Margaery as a true friend, the first one that she's had in King's Landing other than Shae, but more importantly than Shae, because Margaery is a lady from a powerful house. So she meets with Lady Olenna, and they get her to finally admit the truth about Joffrey, which she doesn't realize is set in motion a whole bunch of schemes on Lady Olenna's part. But the next step in her scheme is to marry Loras to her, which of course she was absolutely thrilled at, as she's always seen Loras as this handsome knight in armor ever since Season 1, when he gave her his favor at the tournament, which she brings up again here, and he doesn't remember it, but that doesn't deter her at all. So basically she falls right back in to this naive girl that was overrun by this fantasy that she will marry a handsome prince and live happily ever after, and this time the fantasy has switched to Loras. But really she's being just as naive as before, as Loras is gay and doesn't actually care about marrying her, and not too much at all behind the scenes. A lot of scheming is going on that she's not aware of. So, of course, when Littlefinger approaches her next about leaving King's Landing, she turns him down because she thinks she's marrying Loras. Little does she know this will set in motion schemes that will take her marriage to Loras away from her, and she's told she'll be forced to marry Tyrion. And once again, she's forced to realize that her fantasies of a perfect life are just that, fantasy, and are never going to happen. And worse, this news comes too late, and Littlefinger's offer to take her away from King's Landing no longer stands, as she literally watches that ship sail away. So she's back to being a hostage victim who has no power, as she's forced to marry Tyrion, which is the last thing she wants, as he's not just a Lannister but a dwarf as well. So around him, he just puts on the same pretense she puts on with everyone else. Though she knows he can see through it, it's still her shield. And her wedding night is pretty much a nightmare, as she's humiliated by having to be reminded that she's marrying a dwarf, as Tyrion can't reach her to put the cloak around her, so she has to kneel. And Joffrey is being awful, threatening to rape her, and all the while the knowledge that she'll be forced to have sex with Tyrion looms over her. But to her surprise, when it finally comes to it, he refuses to lay with her, even though his father commands it. And this is where I think she finally gets to see Tyrion in a different light. And soon after, she actually starts to warm up to Tyrion, as we see them having a lovely walk in the gardens together. And even Margaery is trying to reassure her that Tyrion isn't so bad. But then the news of the Red Wedding comes, and she feels ashamed for ever warming up to Tyrion, because he's a member of the family that just slaughtered her mother, her older brother, and her entire family's forces. So she closes back up again and goes back to feeling like a trapped hostage. So then we get to season 4, which is a huge season for Sansa, while she really comes out of her shell and stops being the naive little girl for good. Many feel the shift in character was too sudden, but I disagree. As I just outlined, she suffered disappointment after disappointment, and each one had hardened her to the truth of reality. And after having the handsome prince snatched away from her the second time, and then being forced to marry into the family that just had her brother killed, I think she has completely given up on this fairy tale dream and has realized how ridiculous it was. So season 4 starts with Sansa shutting down and refusing to eat, and refusing Tyrion's attempt at cheering her up, which is a natural reaction to the death of her family. But she actually starts to warm to Tyrion again during Joffrey's wedding, seeing how mistreated he is by Joffrey, actually makes her feel a bit of kinship to him. And I think she's finally starting to accept that Tyrion is in fact different from the other Lannisters. I strongly believe that had she stayed with Tyrion, they would have become a power couple. Maybe not in a romantic way. They wouldn't have become lovers, but they would have been effective partners. But that's not again Sansa's completely naive to all this scheming that's going on, to the fact that Sir Dantos slipped her poison hidden in her necklace, which Lady Olenna took from her and used to kill Joffrey. But as far as she knows, she was just sitting down at a wedding, and all of a sudden Joffrey starts choking, and then Dantos comes up to her and is like, if you want to live, you have to leave with me now. So the next thing she knows, she's running for her life while bells are chiming, and I think she's realizing that she's in imminent danger. But then Dantos takes her out to a boat where she finds none other than Peter Baelish, a Littlefinger, who kills Dantos to thank him for his services. So at this stage, I think she's less worried about getting away from King's Landing and more intrigued by learning all the schemes behind the scenes, and I think she's finally starting to see Littlefinger for who he truly is. And their following conversation, he pretty much tutors her and helps her to try to put everything together, as he reveals that he was in fact at least partly responsible for assassinating Joffrey. So then Littlefinger brings Sansa to the Eyrie to her aunt Eliza, and for the first time in years, she's probably had a feeling of relative safety. It's not the fairy tale life that she dreamed of, but it's more of a realistic sense of security, the kind that she hasn't enjoyed in years. But she soon learns that although she's no longer captive to the Lannisters, her situation is still precarious, as Littlefinger very obviously has ulterior motives for her, and when he kisses her, she gets a sense of what some of these motives are. But she also learns that being in her aunt's company isn't the safe haven she thought it was, as it becomes apparent that she's insane, and Sansa has to use some of her old tricks in playing the victim to try to placate her. But eventually it doesn't work, and Lysa threatens to kill her, so Littlefinger has to step in and kill Lysa instead. Now, what happens next is probably the most important step in Sansa's character journey, and again, I totally disagree with the criticism that this comes out of nowhere, as I strongly feel this was built up to nicely as you saw Sansa taking in Cersei's advice and seeing how she ruled through deceit, but more importantly, learning that Littlefinger was plotting behind her back this whole time, and many of the things she saw and experienced were actually a part of someone else's scheme. So I think this was a huge eye-opener, and plus she had already learned to lie and to deceive, as basically the whole time that she was in King's Landing she was putting on an act, and as I pointed out before, she's already learned to successfully manipulate Joffrey on several occasions. So she decides to put all of what she's learned to use when the Lords of the Vale accuse Littlefinger of killing Lysa, where she tells the truth about who she is, but then lies to protect Littlefinger, saying Lysa killed herself. And this scene was awesome, how she cried to sell her story, harping back to what Cersei said about tears being a powerful weapon. And when Sansa broke character to stare at Littlefinger, letting him know that it was all an act, was just wonderful. It was a great way of Sansa asserting her power over him. Now, Sansa explains why she did it, because it's better to have the devil that she knows than the one she doesn't, which actually isn't very smart, because Littlefinger is far more dangerous than these Vale Lords. So I think that Sansa actually did feel some gratitude to Littlefinger for finally getting her out of King's Landing and saving her life from Lysa, although intellectually she knew he did this for his own motivations that had nothing to do with helping her. I think she still had a subconscious sense of gratitude towards him, but most of all she did it to have power over him. And then next we see her dressed in this beautiful black dress, which really put Littlefinger in awe, which is exactly what she wanted, because she wanted to have him in the palm of her hand. So next we get to season 5, and here's where things go awry, and the fan base become very split on Sansa's storyline. Now, I myself have a lot of issues with how her storyline played out in season 5, as I do think there are a lot of plot holes and character inconsistencies, but overall I disagree with some common criticisms of her season 5 storyline. So much so that I've already done a whole video just analyzing her season 5 storyline to clear up some what I believe are misconceptions. But let's start at the beginning, where she's still in the Vale with Littlefinger, but it's obvious from the start she no longer has a hold on him, and he's scheming for his own purposes. As she can tell that he's up to something, but still is unsure of what he has in mind as they go on the road for an unknown destination. Then they run across Brienne, and Sansa, who is finally happy to get away from the Lannisters' grasp, is understandably very reluctant to go with someone dressed in Lannister armor, even if she claims to serve her family. She's understandably very skeptical, and I do think her skepticism is justified. But this is obviously a massive mistake in retrospect, one she will grow to regret, which will actually shape her character a lot. Because staying with Littlefinger, who obviously was up to no good, was not such a wise move. So it then becomes apparent where Littlefinger is taking her, that is north to Winterfell, which is where the Boltons are, the ones who actively participated in killing her family. So understandably, she does not want to go there, especially when Baelish tells her he's arranged for her to marry the son of the man who killed her brother, Ramsay Bolton. But Littlefinger convinces her that this is the best way to get revenge for her family, and she is smart enough to take control of Winterfell and manipulate these Boltons. I honestly believe that Littlefinger was ignorant to how ruthless and psychotic Ramsay was, and that he was basically handing her over to be tortured and mistreated. I think his honest intention was to have Sansa manipulate the Boltons for his advantage and to be his agent there. I know the fact that he was ignorant to who Ramsay was goes against Littlefinger's character as established in the novels, not to mention that in the novels Ramsay's brutality was common knowledge. However, it's apparent to me that the show is going for in a different direction, and this is the situation that they are establishing. Now, Littlefinger's plan to wait for Stannis to take Winterfell from the Boltons so he can make Sansa Lord of the Winterfell doesn't actually make sense, because if that's the case, why not just deliver Sansa directly to Stannis? She would have been way safer there. So there's either more to Littlefinger's plan than that, what he's letting on, or it's bad writing. And I tend to believe in this case it's the latter, as the writer's end game was to have Sansa marry Ramsay, and they didn't really put much care into how this was carried out. So anyway, once Littlefinger leaves Sansa, she finds herself surrounded by enemies. She meets Ramsay's girlfriend, who's a psycho and is jealous. She learns Ramsay himself is pretty psychotic, and also that Theon, the man who betrayed her family and as far as she knows killed her two younger brothers, is there, and Ramsay seems to take delight in taunting her with this. So some may say this was pretty much the same situation she was in King's Landing in the previous seasons, and it was similar as she was surrounded by enemies, forced to marry someone she doesn't want to, but the difference here is she's different. She's no longer the same person. She's no longer a naive child, but is wise enough of the scheming and manipulation that she knows how to hold her own. One of the best examples of this was when Miranda tried to intimidate her in the bath, but Sansa just stood up right to her and tore her down, and that was awesome. It shows how smart and how confident that she's become. But then her wedding night happened, and from this point forward, Ramsay doesn't hold back. He keeps her as a hostage to be repeatedly raped and beaten. And again, many say this is just her Joffrey storyline all over again, but worse. But I disagree, because again, what's different is her. Even when faced with captivity and torture, rather than feeling defeated and attempting suicide as she did in earlier season, she stands up to her captors, tries to get under Ramsay's skin, and succeeds, and plus tries any means possible to escape, including manipulating Theon. At first she attempts to have his help by trying to build him up, but then he betrays her, so she realized that he has no honor left. So instead she tries the tactic of intimidation and guilting him into helping her, and that eventually works. When Stannis attacks Winterfell, she sees opportunity to escape, to light the candle to summon help, but when no one comes, she tries to find her own way out. Again, this is her affecting her own destiny and taking control in a way that she has never done in King's Landing. And when Miranda catches her and threatens to return her for more torture, Theon wakes up and saves her. But the important thing to note is why Theon wakes up and saves her. He didn't come to this conclusion on his own. It's because of what she did. She made Theon see that he could be more than Reek, and made him feel an obligation to help her. And it's because that she took control of her own destiny that led Theon to breaking free and saving her and himself at the same time. So overall, this storyline was way different than her time in King's Landing. Rather than just being a pawn to be played with, it shows her taking control of her own destiny in order to enact escape. Which brings us to season 6, where Sansa becomes a product of all the trauma she suffered, but instead of hiding and being haunted by it like Theon is, she uses it to affect her own destiny and that of her house. So her season 6 storyline begins with her still on the run from the Boltons, where she's brave enough to get into freezing cold water in order to try to get away from them. However, it turns out to be for nothing as the Boltons catch up to her and it looks like she's done for. But Brienne shows up and takes care of the Bolton men and saves her. And Sansa, while she's freezing, repeats the words to make Brienne her sworn protector. Now, Sansa's not a genius for accepting Brienne's service this time, as this time she'd be an idiot not to, as Brienne had apparently followed her all the way up north and just saved her life from going back to the worst torture that she's ever known. So this isn't so much of an example of Sansa taking control of her own destiny and more of her being lucky, but it's a great lesson for her as she's realized that she made a mistake by trusting Littlefinger and not trusting Brienne. It's also a lesson that things aren't always what they appear, as it appeared that Brienne was a Lannister crony who was dressed in Lannister armor, who she just saw earlier bowing to Joffrey at his wedding, and yet it turned out she did in fact have her best interest at heart. And instead she went with Littlefinger, who gave her to a monster that tortured her. So Brienne then tells Sansa that her sister Arya is still alive and takes her north to Castle Black. Theon decides to part ways and return to the Iron Island, and Sansa graciously gives him her thanks for saving her life. So Sansa arrives at Castle Black to have a touching reunion with her half-brother Jon Snow, and it was really touching, and they reminisce about old times. However, Sansa and Jon were never that close before, and it's even mentioned that Sansa was horrible to Jon. And although she apologizes to him, I think she doesn't fully trust him, nor does she know all of what he's been through since they last saw each other. All she knows is that he's family and that he's also devoted to their family. So she tries to use that to manipulate him to get him to take Winterfell back from the Boltons. At first this doesn't work because he knows they are outnumbered, but when Ramsay sends them a letter threatening to recapture Sansa, kill Jon, and kill their brother Rickon, whom apparently he reveals that he has hostage. So this finally forces Jon to agree to Sansa's plan. In the meantime, Sansa reunites with Littlefinger and berates him for giving her to Ramsay and makes it clear that she doesn't trust him. She even goes as far as to threaten to have Brienne kill her. Littlefinger offers the help of the Vale army in her cause, but she refuses him and sends Littlefinger away. But she doesn't tell Jon of this offer, and in fact, she goes with Jon and Davos on a tour around the north to recruit more families to their cause, but never mentions to Jon that they have access to a big force. But this tour of all to try to entice these families to join their cause was another big learning moment for Sansa and a huge change, as for the first time in her life she had to behave as the head of a proud house. Even though she wasn't technically the head of the house, Jon was, she was mostly satisfied to let him have that role because she had obviously learned from Cersei how a lord should present themselves as proud and commanding. However, this approach was met with poor results. When she tried being all proud and commanding, both Lyanna Mormont and Lord Glover did not seem impressed. With Lyanna Mormont, it took Davos showing her respect and speaking to her on her terms to gain her favor. With Lord Glover, nothing would win him over, and when she tried to intimidate him into obedience, that didn't work either. Mainly because she knew they didn't have the power to back up her intimidation. So they managed to convince a few minor houses to join their cause, but really their fighting force was made up almost entirely of wildlings. So Sansa, having realized that a family name and bluster isn't enough, that you need to be able to back up your claims, recognizes that their forces were not strong enough. And she went to Jon and tried to get him to postpone the battle until they could get more men, but Jon was convinced, and perhaps rightfully so, that they would not be able to get more men ever, so they had to go forward immediately. So, in a very controversial decision, Sansa decides to contact Littlefinger behind Jon's back, and in fact, still withholds the fact that they could have access to more men in the form of the powerful Vale army from Jon. So this illustrates that she doesn't fully trust Jon, as she still considers him naive of what he's actually facing, and also she doesn't trust Littlefinger because of how his scheming had affected her in the past. So there are many who have criticized Sansa for this decision, and I won't get into that debate here, only to say, for better or for worse, her traumatizing experiences combined with being exposed to schemers like Cersei and Littlefinger all her life had taught her to play her cards close to the chest, and it made her weary of trusting others, even her own brother. So when they go to parley with Ramsay before the battle, where Jon and Ramsay exchange bolstering banter, Sansa simply states that Ramsay is going to die and then rides off. So it's evident killing Ramsay is more important to her than anything. And afterwards in the camp, when Jon and his generals strategize about the upcoming battle, Sansa recognizes that Jon is ignorant of Ramsay's advantage and his motivations and the tactics he was used, and that Ramsay is going to get the better of him. However, she learns a lot about political strategizing, but nothing of battle tactics, unfortunately, so isn't able to offer up any specific advice that would be helpful to Jon. But when the battle plays out, we see that everything Sansa said was correct, that Ramsay wouldn't be instigated or manipulated by Jon, that would in fact be the other way around. So Sansa was able to read the situation correctly, but didn't have the military knowledge to advise him precisely what to do about it. So what Sansa does next happens off screen, so I can only guess at her specific motivations and intentions here. But where the Battle of the Bastards happens, and Jon finds himself losing with Ramsay surrounding all of his forces with the men with shields and spears, and they're slowly crushing his entire army to death, Sansa arrives with Littlefinger and the Vale army right at the exact time needed to in order to win, as Ramsay's forces are completely exposed to outside attack. So the Vale army easily comes in and wipes out the Bolton forces, allowing Jon and his forces to win the battle. Now, some have argued that many of Jon's troops died because Sansa didn't share with Jon the fact that the Vale army was coming, and I would argue, however, that the Vale army came at the exact correct time in order to win the battle. Had Sansa told Jon, this may not have been the case, and perhaps she was worried that Jon would misuse these troops. This is only speculation because most of this occurs off screen, and I can only guess as to what Sansa was thinking. However, what is apparent is that because of the Vale army coming exactly when they did, they were able to win the Battle of the Bastards. So once inside Winterfell, Jon starts beating Ramsay to a bloody pulp. That is until looking at Sansa, who isn't pleased. He then realizes that with everything that Ramsay did to her, it's her place to punish him, not his. So he locks him up in a dungeon, leaving Sansa to deal with him. And deal with him she does by having his own dogs rip him apart, where she taunts him that his family is no more and everything he's done will disappear. She then smiles and takes enjoyment out of this very brutal and painful death that she is giving him. Now, while many, including myself, would say Ramsay got what he deserved and his death was justified, it does say something that Sansa was able to have someone brutally killed and take pleasure in it. It does show that all the time she spent with Cersei did have some effect on her, perhaps even to make her more like her. And regardless of how justified she was, it shows how ruthless that she's become, a far cry from the naive girl wanting to marry a handsome prince. Later, she and Jon reconcile, and she apologizes to him for not telling him about the Vale army, and they both acknowledge that they're going to need to work together if they want to succeed. However, even though Sansa promises to work with Jon, it is evident that she still doesn't completely trust him and has her doubts about him. However, when they meet with all the lords of the north, the lords pronounce Jon king in the north. Sansa at first appears very pleased by this, but then gets a disapproving look from Littlefinger, and I think she's reminded of her distrust in Jon and isn't entirely confident that he's up to the task. And this feeling likely colors how she will behave in the coming days. So finally, we get to Season 7, which shows Sansa growing in a leadership role after her house has returned to power, and her Season 7 storyline focuses primarily on her learning to work with her family and overcome conflicts or any differences they may have. After all, she had spent the majority of her life alone, away from her family, and they have all grown up in different ways since they were last together. So in Season 7, we mostly deal with the Starks learning to be a family again. So Season 7 begins with Sansa and Jon meeting with the Northern Lords, where Jon forgives the young heirs to House Umber and House Karstark, who sided against the Starks in the Battle of the Bastards, and allows them to keep their castles and their family titles. This goes directly against Sansa's wishes, who wanted to have their lands and titles stripped from them for their betrayal. Now, there's many discussions on who's right and who's wrong in this situation, and it's really a matter of opinion, and there are no clear answers. I personally am of the opinion that they are both right and that they are both wrong. That Jon is right to not hold the actions of their older relatives against them and recognizes that the real threat is the White Walkers, and they need all of the men they can get to fight against them. But Sansa is also right for worrying about how the other lords who did support the Starks all along may feel slighted and underappreciated by this act. But Sansa was wrong for undermining Jon's authority by openly challenging his decision in public. This is something she should have done in private. But on the other hand, Jon was also wrong for not telling Sansa about his plans beforehand to allow her the chance to voice her concerns in private before he made this decision public. So overall, it just goes to show that the two of them don't completely trust each other and still need to learn to work together. In the next meeting, however, Jon once again makes a decision without consulting Sansa, who once again voices her opposition in public and thus undermining his authority once again. When Jon announces that he will be leaving the north to travel to Dragonstone in an attempt to make an alliance with Daenerys Targaryen, who has dragons and dragonglass which would be useful in the fight against the White Walkers. However, Sansa's concerns are calmed when Jon announces he will be putting her in charge in his absence and that he has full confidence in her. I think this act goes a long way to higher Sansa's opinion of Jon in her eyes and trust him more, even if she doesn't always agree with his decisions. While Jon is away, Sansa proves to be a very effective leader who, although keeps Littlefinger close by, as he is Lord Protector of the Vale, still keeps him at arm's length and makes it clear that she does not fully trust him. However, even so, it's obvious that Littlefinger is somewhat successful in planting seeds of doubt in her mind about Jon's ability to rule. However, then her brother Bran returns to Winterfell, whom she thought she'd never see again, but her joy at being reunited with her long-lost brother is soured when she learns the type of person that he's become, an emotionless seer who's able to see things happening all around the world in the past and present as he tells her things about her wedding night with Ramsay, arguably the worst night of her life, and his very dispassionate way describes the night, which of course is very alarming for her. She also offers Bran the leadership of Winterfell, but he rejects it, saying that he can't be Lord. It's hard to say whether Sansa was eager to relinquish her leadership role. I think it was more of the Stark side in her wanting to do the honorable thing. I actually think she was somewhat relieved when Bran turned the offer down. Soon after her long-lost brother returned, her long-lost sister returned as well, as she finds Arya returns to Winterfell, and at first this reunion is more happy than her other one, as Arya genuinely appears happy to see her and they reminisce. But the more she talks to her, the more she sees Arya has completely changed into a different person as well. Arya talks about having a kill list where she kills a bunch of people who wronged her family. And at first Sansa thinks she's joking. Arya seems to let her think that, but then Bran in his dispassionate way confirms her kill list is in fact real and she has killed many people. And this information that Arya is now a heartless killer is confirmed even more when Sansa sees Arya training with Brienne in the courtyard, where Arya manages to best Brienne, the best fighter Sansa has ever seen. So this concerns Sansa, as she's forced to deal with the strange people in her family that they've become. Jon was more or less the brother she remembered, although he had been hardened by his experiences, which included coming back from the dead. He's more or less as she remembered him, whereas Bran and Arya had become entirely different people with strange and dark abilities, which frighten her, and rightfully so. Now Sansa meets with the Northern Lords, who are unhappy about Jon going south, and so they suggest making her Queen of the North, but she rightfully turns them down. I think not only she learned to trust Jon more, but also she knows such betrayal would only be bad for their family. However, Arya confronts her about this encounter and accuses her of secretly wanting to become Queen of the North, and this strikes a nerve with Sansa because I believe there is some truth to it. After all, we see in her character story, it begins with her wanting to be a queen. That version of it was some idealistic fairy tale version, and she had learned to let go of that and accept reality for what it is. However, I think the aspect of wanting to be queen never went away. However, this is a dark desire that Sansa tries to bury, so Arya exposing it only helps her to recognize and overcome it and find a way to move past it. So Sansa's concerns about Arya are brought into full force when Sansa appears to be reminiscing with Arya about her family, about her father, when suddenly Arya accuses her of betraying her family because of the letter that she was forced to write to Robb on Cersei's behalf. Sansa tries to explain that she was coerced and that she was simply doing what she thought would have saved their father's life. But Arya refuses to listen. Sansa very strongly stands up to Arya, saying Arya should be thanking her for taking Winterfell back, but Arya seems unimpressed. Sansa then goes to Littlefinger about her concerns, who only seems to stoke her worries. So Sansa finds herself searching Arya's room for the letter, as she's afraid Arya will show it to the Northern Lords, which would undermine her authority. However, when searching Arya's room, instead of finding the letter, she finds Arya's faces, which understandably scare her. And then Arya finds her there and starts acting very intimidating while talking about her training as a faceless man. And in fact, Arya is outright threatening to Sansa, telling her she kills people and steals their faces to pretend to be them, and even goes as far as to threaten to do this to Sansa. So Sansa is understandably extremely worried about this, as well as she's concerned about a letter she received from Jon informing her that he's bent the knee to Daenerys Targaryen and has pledged the North to her cause. She discusses these issues with Littlefinger, who suggests that perhaps the time has come for Sansa to rule Winterfell and rule the North. As Sansa has seen in the past, the Northern Lord's loyalties were very fleeting, so convincing them to follow her instead of Jon, particularly when he suggests bending the knee to Daenerys, would be an easy task. But more than that, Littlefinger manipulates Sansa in order to paint a scenario that Arya has returned to Winterfell for the express purpose of killing her for betraying their family and maintaining Jon's rule. So the suggestion here is plain. Have Arya executed and take rule over the North. Something the ambitious side of her that she learned from Cersei must have found very tempting. So next we see Sansa. She has Arya called into the hall at Winterfell as she sits alongside Bran in front of all the Northern Lords and then speaks accusations of murder, treason, and conspiracy. But instead of speaking Arya's name, she looks to Peter Baelish and says his name, as apparently Bran had told her everything about Littlefinger had done in starting the War of the Five Kings, betraying their father, and trying to pit her against her own sister and brother. And so Sansa learns a very valuable lesson here, and that is to trust in her family, and that the schemers like Littlefinger are never to be trusted. And so she has Arya execute Littlefinger. And her and Arya then wait for Jon's return, whom she intends to follow, having learned that she needs to trust her family, and she learns to appreciate Arya and Bran as well as to put her trust in them. As she says the words her father once told them, that the lone wolf dies but the pack survives, making it clear to her now that family is the most important thing and more important than her own ambitions. Now, I was of course unhappy with the way this was executed in this show. I thought we didn't see enough of the story to make it clear what was going on, and it seemed a bit forced and fake, but I can tell that this was what they were going for. So this was the story arc season 7 was trying to tell. So that is Sansa's storyline up to this point. With only one season left, it remains to be seen where Sansa will go from here. Now that she's learned to be a powerful ruler, to be deceitful when necessary, diplomatic when necessary, and learn to trust in her family as together they are stronger. Some still speculate that she will rule over all of Westeros, while others say she will just rule the North. It's possible she's meant to have an unsavory end, but I doubt it. I personally see her storyline has been leading her to a journey of being a ruler, and not just a ruler, but a wise and just one, but we will just have to see. So that's it for my character journey analysis for Sansa Stark. Thank you so much for watching this, and thank you to patron Allison Fordyce for suggesting this video. Also, special thanks to other patrons, Cardinal Doomsday and Marilyn Bentley. Thanks so much for supporting my channel. It's very helpful. And if you'd like to support the channel, you can follow the link in the description below to my Patreon page, where if you donate $1 or more, you can gain access to my Patreon-only video series, which at the moment is a video series on my favorite and least favorite director's cuts of my favorite films. And you'll also receive access to my monthly schedules, which detail which videos I have planned coming up. If you'd like to donate $10 or more, you will also have those abilities, and also the ability to make a video request such as this one, where I try to do the requested video within a month. However, thanks to all those who support this channel through your views, likes, and subscriptions. That is also very much appreciated. Keep an eye out as I continue to do Game of Thrones videos, as well as many other videos on shows like Star Trek and more, and thanks a lot for watching.